Angela Carter stood at the entrance of one of the busiest airports in the country, the cacophony of announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried footsteps enveloping her like a chaotic symphony. This wasn't just any visit. As the newly appointed TSA commander, Angela had spent weeks crafting a surprise inspection plan designed to root out inefficiencies, misconduct, and systemic biases within the organization. She was well aware of the challenges ahead. The TSA was a sprawling institution with countless moving parts, and not all of those parts worked in harmony. But Angela had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had built her career by taking on the toughest roles and succeeding where others had failed, her unyielding sense of justice her guiding principle. Today's visit was personal. Angela was not here as the commander in a pressed uniform flanked by subordinates. She had come incognito, blending into the crowd as just another traveler. Dressed in a simple black tracksuit and carrying a small backpack, she looked like any other weary flyer navigating the labyrinth of airport security. No badges, no entourage, just Angela Carter, a woman determined to see the cracks in the system from the ground level. This was her way of understanding what needed to change a raw, unfiltered perspective of what passengers and TSA employees dealt with daily. Angela moved purposefully toward the security checkpoint, her sharp eyes scanning everything around her. Despite her casual appearance, her mind was razor-focused, noting every interaction, every procedure. Her years of experience had taught her that change didn't happen in boardrooms but on the ground, where policy met reality. She spotted officers chatting idly while the lines grew longer, others mechanically barking orders at passengers without a hint of courtesy. Some passengers shuffled nervously, while others were visibly irritated by the inefficiency. Angela had anticipated much of this. After all, her role wasn't to reinforce the status quo, but to dismantle it where necessary. However, what she hadn't anticipated was the man stationed at Lane 5. Officer Kevin Dunnings had been with the TSA for over a decade, a career marked more by controversy than commendation. Known for his aggressive demeanor and quick temper, Kevin was the kind of officer who treated his uniform as a badge of unchecked power rather than responsibility. His colleagues avoided him when they could, and his supervisors had long stopped trying to reform his behavior. Kevin's recent disciplinary hearing for an unnecessary use of force had only emboldened him further, making him more volatile. To him, every passenger was a potential suspect, every situation a chance to exert authority. And when his eyes landed on Angela Carter, standing calmly in line, something about her struck a nerve. Angela, oblivious to Kevin's growing fixation, approached the conveyor belt where passengers placed their belongings. She efficiently removed her shoes, unzipped her backpack, and placed everything neatly in a tray. Kevin, meanwhile, leaned against the podium with a smirk, his eyes narrowing as he watched her movements. To him, she didn't fit the mold of a typical traveler. Her composure, her deliberate action, something about her screamed trouble to him. It wasn't rational, but Kevin rarely operated on logic. He thrived on gut instincts, no matter how misguided they were. As Angela passed through the metal detector without issue, Kevin's suspicions only deepened. He casually flagged her down, gesturing for her to step aside. Angela, ever composed, followed his instructions without hesitation. She had encountered officers like Kevin throughout her career, men who mistook their authority for superiority, who saw control as their primary goal rather than service. She didn't recognize Kevin, of course, but his body language and tone were all too familiar. "Step over here," Kevin barked, his voice unnecessarily loud, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Angela complied, her expression neutral. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked evenly, her voice calm but firm. Kevin ignored her question, instead pointing to her backpack, which had just emerged from the X-ray scanner. "That yours?" he asked curtly. Angela nodded. "Yes, it is." "Is something wrong with it?" Kevin didn't answer immediately. He gestured toward the screen, calling over another officer to review the scan. Angela glanced at the monitor, her sharp eyes quickly discerning that there was nothing unusual about her bag's contents, just a laptop, a few personal items and some papers. But Kevin wasn't interested in facts. He was interested in control. "We'll need to take a closer look," Kevin announced, motioning for Angela to follow him to a nearby table. By now, a few passengers were watching the interaction, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Angela followed without protest, though her mind was already working, cataloguing every detail of the encounter. She knew better than to push back too soon. Observing Kevin's behavior without interfering would give her more insight into the type of officer he was. At the table, Kevin unzipped her backpack and began rummaging through it with little regard for her belongings. He pulled out her laptop and flipped it over, inspecting it as though expecting to find something hidden beneath the surface. Then he moved the papers, leafing through them carelessly. As Kevin's hands rifled through her belongings, Angela felt a flicker of irritation. She reminded herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her, it was about uncovering the systemic flaws that allowed officers like Kevin to operate unchecked. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she asked, her voice steady. Kevin looked up, his smirk widening. "You seem pretty calm for someone being searched. Got something to hide?" The accusation was so baseless it was almost laughable, but Angela didn't take the bait. Instead, she met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'm calm because I know I've done nothing wrong," she replied. "Are you looking for something in particular, or is this standard procedure?" Kevin didn't respond immediately. Her composure irritated him, and his frustration began to show. He straightened up, his posture stiffening as he gestured for another officer to join them. "This passenger needs a pat-down," Kevin announced, his tone dripping with authority. Angela raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, Kevin added, "Standard protocol." It was anything but standard, and Angela knew it. Still, she allowed the female officer who approached to conduct the pat-down, knowing that resisting would only escalate the situation. The pat-down, predictably, revealed nothing. Angela was clean, her belongings unremarkable. But Kevin wasn't done. He gestured toward her again. "Step over here. I want to ask you a few questions." Angela followed, her patience wearing thin. This wasn't an inspection anymore, it was harassment, and she was done playing along. Angela stopped abruptly, fixing Kevin with a steely gaze. "Officer," she said, her voice firm and commanding in a way that stopped him in his tracks. "You've made your point. Now I'm going to make mine. You're out of line. This is not how you treat passengers, and this is not how you uphold the standards of your position." Kevin blinked, momentarily stunned by her shift in tone, but before he could respond, Angela reached into her pocket and produced a small ID badge, flipping it open to reveal her credentials. "I'm Angela Carter, commander of the TSA, and you're about to explain your behavior to me in great detail." The color drained from Kevin's face as the realization hit him. Around them, the murmur of passengers grew louder, and the officers who had gathered to watch the spectacle exchanged uneasy glances. For a brief moment, Kevin looked like he might argue, but the weight of Angela's authority was undeniable. He stammered something unintelligible, his bravado crumbling as Angela's piercing gaze bore into him. "Let's talk," she said, her voice low and icy. And with that, she led him toward the administrative offices, the crowd parting to let them pass. Kevin Dunnings had never been a man to back down, not when his authority was questioned, and especially not when he felt like someone was undermining him. But as he followed Angela Carter into the administrative offices, his bravado wavered. The badge she'd revealed moments earlier still burned in his mind. Commander of the TSA. It didn't seem possible. How could this woman, someone he had dismissed as just another ordinary traveler, be one of the most powerful figures in their agency? Kevin's mind raced as Angela strode ahead, her posture commanding yet unnervingly calm. He couldn't reconcile her quiet demeanor with the storm brewing in her presence. Angela, for her part, was carefully controlling her emotions. The encounter with Kevin had gone beyond what she had expected. She had anticipated finding inefficiencies, perhaps even mild misconduct. What she hadn't anticipated was the sheer audacity of someone like Kevin, a man so drunk on his perceived authority that he saw no issue with bending the rules to suit his whims. But Angela wasn't angry just because of what had been done to her. She was angry because Kevin's behavior represented a systemic issue. How many passengers had been subjected to this kind of treatment? How many had been intimidated or humiliated by someone who was supposed to ensure their safety? Angela's mind churned with these questions as they reached the small, sterile conference room tucked away in the back offices of the terminal. She gestured for Kevin to sit down at the table. "Take a seat, Officer Dunnings," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. Kevin hesitated for a moment before complying, sinking heavily into the chair. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some kind of lifeline, but there was no one else there. Angela closed the door behind her and leaned against it, crossing her arms. She didn't sit down. She didn't need to. Her presence filled the room, and Kevin could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. "Do you know why I'm here?" Angela began, her voice steady but sharp. Kevin opened his mouth to answer but faltered, unsure of what to say. "I'll tell you why," Angela continued, not giving him a chance to recover. "I'm here because the TSA has a problem with professionalism, a problem with accountability, a problem with people like you." The last words hit Kevin like a blow. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the table, as if to anchor himself. "Ma'am," he began, his voice strained, "I was just doing my job." "I followed protocol." Angela cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. "Don't insult my intelligence, Officer Dunnings. What you were doing out there had nothing to do with protocol. It had everything to do with your ego." Kevin's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Angela took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You think I don't know what you were doing? That I can't recognize harassment when I see it? You singled me out because you thought you could, because you thought you were untouchable." Kevin's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but every excuse he could think of sounded hollow, even to him. Angela's words struck too close to the truth. He had singled her out, though he hadn't expected it to spiral into this. He just wanted to exert a little control, to remind himself that he was in charge. But now he was sitting across from someone who clearly held more power than he ever could, and the realization was suffocating. Angela leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. "Do you have any idea how dangerous your behavior is?" she asked, her voice low but seething with intensity. "You turned a routine security check into a spectacle. You used physical force when there was no justification for it. You humiliated a passenger me because you wanted to feel powerful. What if I hadn't been who I am? What if it had been someone else? Someone less equipped to stand up to you? What would you have done then?" Kevin's throat felt dry. He couldn't meet her eyes. I didn't mean," he stammered, but Angela cut him off again. "You didn't mean to get caught," she snapped. "That's what you didn't mean. Don't pretend this was an isolated incident, Officer Dunnings. I've seen your record. I know this isn't the first time you've crossed the line. So don't sit there and try to justify yourself to me. Kevin's head snapped up at that. My record? He asked, his voice tinged with indignation. You've looked at my record? Angela raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his sudden defiance. Of course I've looked at your record. Do you think I came here unprepared? I know exactly who you are, Officer Dunnings, and I know exactly why people like you are a liability to this agency. Kevin clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling to the surface. With all due respect, Ma'am, I've been with the TSA for over 10 years. I've done my job to the best of my ability. I've kept people safe. I've followed the rules. Angela's laugh was cold and sharp, cutting through his words like a blade. You think this is about following the rules? She asked, her voice dripping with incredulity. This is about the trust you've broken. Passengers are supposed to feel safe when they go through security. They're supposed to feel respected. You've made them feel threatened. You've made them feel small. And that's unacceptable. Kevin felt his anger giving way to something else, some colder, heavier. Shame. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Not against her. Angela straightened up, her gaze still locked on him. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her tone brooking no argument. You're going to be suspended, effective immediately. There will be a full investigation into your conduct, and if I find even the slightest indication that this kind of behavior is part of a larger pattern, and believe me, you'll be out of this job before you can even think about appealing the decision. Kevin's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but Angela raised a hand to silence him. This isn't negotiable, she said firmly. You've had your chances. Now you'll face the consequences. She turned toward the door, her hand on the handle. But before she left, she paused and looked back at him. And Officer Dunnings? Kevin glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of fear and resentment. You should think long and hard about why you're in this position. Because if you don't, you'll find yourself here again, and next time, you won't even get the courtesy of a warning. With that, she opened the door and walked out, leaving Kevin alone in the sterile conference room. For the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. The authority he had wielded so recklessly was gone, stripped away in a matter of minutes by someone who refused to tolerate his abuse of it. As he sat there, the weight of his actions settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had made a mistake that might cost him everything. And deep down, he knew Angela Carter wasn't done with him yet. Angela Carter stepped out of the small conference room, leaving Kevin Dunnings sitting in stunned silence. Her heels clicked sharply against the linoleum floor as she made her way back toward the security checkpoint. Every step she took felt deliberate, each one carrying the weight of her resolve. The encounter with Kevin had left her seething not with personal anger, but with a sense of responsibility. His behavior wasn't an anomaly, it was a symptom of a much larger problem. If she didn't address it now, it would fester and infect the agency further. But Angela's mind was still working. She knew Kevin's reaction wasn't just about ego or bravado. There was something deeper, a layer of hostility and recklessness that hinted at a toxic environment within the TSA at this airport. She'd seen the way his colleagues avoided eye contact during the incident, how they stood idly by instead of intervening. That wasn't just fear of confrontation, it was complicity. Angela decided she wasn't leaving until she got to the root of it. As she approached the checkpoint, she noticed the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier altercation were whispering among themselves, their glances shifting between the security officers and Angela. The tension in the air was palpable. Angela scanned the area, her sharp eyes catching every detail, a supervisor standing near the exit, pretending to check paperwork while clearly trying to gauge the fallout, an officer at the scanner, nervously glancing in her direction. Another officer, standing rigid and avoiding her gaze entirely. These were the signs of a fractured workplace, one where trust and accountability had eroded over time. Angela stopped in the middle of the checkpoint and addressed the gathered officers. Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. All TSA personnel stepped forward. Now. The command had an electrifying effect. Officers hesitated, exchanged uncertain looks, and then slowly moved toward her, forming a loose semicircle. The passengers watched intently, their curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in power dynamics. Angela waited until every officer was in front of her before she spoke again. "Let me make something perfectly clear," she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "What I witnessed here today was unacceptable. The behavior I've seen from some of you, your lack of professionalism, your abuse of authority, your failure to uphold the standards of this agency is not just disappointing. It's dangerous. It undermines everything the TSA is supposed to stand for." She paused, letting her words sink in. The officers stood frozen, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. One of them, a younger man with a nervous energy, opened his mouth to speak but quickly thought better of it. Angela continued, "You may think no one is watching, that the passengers will shrug it off, or that your colleagues will cover for you. But let me tell you something, I am watching. And I will not tolerate what I've seen here today." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Then, from the back of the group, a voice broke the silence. "With all due respect, Ma'am, we're just following protocol." Angela turned her gaze toward the speaker, a middle-aged officer with a defensive posture. He was trying to sound confident, but the slight tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. She walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "Your name?" she asked, her tone neutral but firm. "Officer Rodriguez," he replied, his eyes flicking toward his colleagues for support. None came. "Officer Rodriguez?" Angela said, her voice steady. "What part of protocol involves manhandling a passenger without cause? What part of protocol involves ignoring clear signs of misconduct from your colleagues? What part of protocol allows this level of incompetence and indifference to go unchecked?" Rodriguez flinched at her words but didn't respond. Angela took another step closer, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "Do you know what happens when passengers lose faith in the TSA? They stop trusting us. They stop cooperating. And when that happens, the entire system falls apart. Is that the kind of legacy you want to leave behind?" Rodriguez shook his head, his confidence crumbling under her scrutiny. Angela straightened up and addressed the rest of the group. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about all of you. Every time you turn a blind eye to misconduct, every time you cut corners or bend the rules, you're complicit. You're part of the problem. And I'm here to fix it." Her words were met with silence, the weight of her authority pressing down on the officers like a physical force. Finally, she stepped back and gestured toward the supervisor who had been lingering near the exit. "You, come here." The supervisor, a man in his late 40s with a polished demeanor, approached cautiously. His badge read Supervisor Daniels. Angela wasted no time. "Supervisor Daniels, you've been standing there this entire time, watching everything unfold. Tell me, what's your assessment of the situation?" Daniels hesitated, his carefully maintained composure starting to crack. "Well, ma'am, I believe there was a misunderstanding. Officer Dunnings is usually very professional, and I think—" Angela cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Stop. I'm not interested in excuses. I'm asking for your assessment. Do you believe Officer Dunning's actions today were appropriate?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the other officers. "No, ma'am," he admitted reluctantly. "I don't believe they were." "Then why didn't you intervene?" Angela asked, her tone colder now. Why didn't you step in and correct the situation before it escalated? Daniels swallowed hard. I didn't want to undermine his authority in front of the passengers. Angela's eyes narrowed. Undermine his authority. Supervisor Daniels, your job is not to protect an officer's ego. Your job is to ensure the safety and dignity of every passenger who comes through this checkpoint. And you failed. Daniels looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. Angela turned back to the assembled officers, her voice rising with a renewed intensity. Let this be a warning to all of you. I will not tolerate incompetence. I will not tolerate abuse of power. And I will not tolerate a culture of silence. If you see something wrong, you speak up. If you see someone overstepping their bounds, you intervene. That's what it means to be part of this agency. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the group. This isn't just about keeping the skies safe. It's about earning the trust of the people we serve. And if you can't do that, if you're not willing to hold yourself and your colleagues to the highest standards, then you have no place here. The officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. Angela took a step back, her posture unwavering. Now, get back to work. And remember, I'll be watching. The group dispersed reluctantly, their expressions a mixture of shame and determination. Angela watched them go, her mind already turning to the next steps. She knew this was just the beginning. Rooting out the problems within the TSA would take more than a single confrontation. It would take systemic change, accountability, and a relentless commitment to doing what was right. But Angela was ready. She hadn't taken this job to maintain the status quo. She had taken it to make a difference. As she turned to leave, Angela caught sight of Kevin Dunnings being escorted out of the checkpoint by two senior officers. His face was pale, his usual swagger replaced by a look of utter defeat. Angela felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a grim determination to ensure that no one else would suffer because of his actions. She would see this through, no matter what it took, because that was who Angela Carter was, a leader who didn't just demand change but made it happen. Angela Carter stepped into the airport's administrative offices, her mind racing. The events of the morning had confirmed what she had long suspected. The system was broken, and the cracks ran deeper than she had anticipated. Kevin Dunnings wasn't an outlier. He was a symptom of a larger culture that allowed negligence, prejudice, and unchecked aggression to flourish. She had no intention of leaving this airport without addressing it head-on. But for now there was another matter that demanded her immediate attention. The incident she had just endured wasn't just a moment of misconduct. It was emblematic of a much bigger threat, one that could jeopardize not only her mission but the integrity of the TSA itself. Angela's presence in the office caused a ripple effect. Staff members who had been lingering near desks or casually chatting suddenly became tense, their postures stiffening as they registered who she was. The sharp clack of her heels against the polished floors announced her approach like a drumbeat, each step purposeful, each one demanding attention. She moved with the air of someone who wasn't to be questioned, her focus unrelenting. The few employees who had witnessed her earlier confrontation with Kevin Dunnings quickly looked away, pretending to be engrossed in their work. Angela took it all in, the unease, the avoidance, the whispers. This wasn't just fear, it was guilt. People knew more than they were letting on, and Angela intended to find out exactly what. She reached the main operations desk, where a senior administrator, Nancy Collins, was stationed. Nancy was a veteran of the TSA, her crisp uniform and perfectly styled hair projecting an air of authority. But as Angela approached, even Nancy seemed to falter, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard as she stood to greet her. "Commander Carter," Nancy said, her voice carefully measured. What can I do for you? Angela didn't waste time with pleasantries. I need access to all incident reports filed by Officer Kevin Dunnings in the past 12 months, she said firmly. I also want a list of any formal complaints made against him, whether they were escalated or not. Nancy blinked, clearly taken aback by the directness of the request. Of course, ma'am, she replied, her hands moving quickly to bring up the requested files on her computer. But if I may ask, is this about what happened earlier? Angela's gaze was sharp. It's about more than that, she replied. What I witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, one that I'm beginning to think has been ignored for far too long. Nancy swallowed hard and nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled up the records. The sound of the printer whirring to life filled the silence as it began spitting out pages of reports. Angela stood in silence, her arms crossed, her mind already piecing together the steps she would take next. She wasn't just here to discipline one officer. She was here to overhaul the system that had allowed someone like Kevin to thrive. When the reports were ready, Angela gathered the thick stack of papers and carried them to a nearby conference room, where she could review them without interruption. She closed the door behind her, the sudden quiet a stark contrast to the bustling activity of the airport. Sitting at the long, sterile table, she spread out the documents in front of her, her eyes scanning each page with laser focus. What she found was even worse than she had expected. Kevin's record was riddled with red flags. There were multiple complaints from passengers accusing him of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional behavior. One report detailed how he had forcibly detained a young woman traveling with her child, claiming she had acted suspiciously simply because she had asked too many questions about the screening process. Another described how Kevin had berated an elderly man in front of a line of passengers, accusing him of holding up the checkpoint, when, in reality, the man had been struggling to remove his shoes due to a physical disability. These incidents had all been documented, but none had resulted in significant disciplinary action. Instead, they were met with vague notations like addressed internally or officer-counseled. It was a damning pattern of neglect, and Angela felt her frustration mounting with each page she turned. But it wasn't just the complaints that caught her attention. Tucked among the records was a series of incident logs that hinted at something far more troubling. Kevin had been involved in several high-value confiscations, expensive electronics, jewelry, even cash that had mysteriously disappeared from evidence storage. Each case had been marked as unresolved with no follow-up investigation. Angela's instincts flared. This wasn't just about misconduct anymore. It was starting to look like corruption. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The door opened to reveal Nancy Collins, holding another folder in her hands. "Commander, I thought you might want to see this," Nancy said, placing the folder on the table. It's a collection of informal notes from other officers about Dunnings. They weren't part of the official reports. But, well, I think they're relevant. Angela opened the folder and began reading. The notes painted an even darker picture of Kevin's behavior. Colleagues described him as unpredictable, aggressive, and someone to avoid. One note detailed how he had intimidated a junior officer into falsifying a report about a passenger complaint. Another described how he had deliberately escalated minor situations to justify using force. The more Angela read, the clearer it became that Kevin wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a bully who had been protected by a culture of silence. "Thank you, Nancy," Angela said, closing the folder. "This is exactly what I needed." Nancy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Ma'am, if I may, There are others who feel the same way you do. About Dunnings, I mean. But they've been afraid to speak up. He has connections. Angela looked up sharply. What kind of connections? Nancy glanced around the room, as if worried someone might overhear. He's close with some of the higher-ups, she said in a hushed tone. People who've been here a long time, who don't like change. They've been covering for him, and not just him. There are others like him, officers who think they can get away with anything because they know someone will back them up. Angela's jaw tightened. This was exactly what she had feared. The rot wasn't limited to Kevin, it was systemic, embedded in the very foundation of the airport's operations. But if those higher-ups thought she would back down, they had severely underestimated her. "Thank you for telling me, Nancy," Angela said. "I know it's not easy to speak out, but I need people like you if we're going to fix this." Nancy nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and determination. "I'll do whatever I can to help, ma'am." Angela stood, gathering the documents and notes into a neat stack. "Good, because things are about to change." She left the conference room with a renewed sense of purpose, her steps quick and decisive as she made her way to the airport's main operations center. She had reviewed enough, seen enough, to know what needed to happen next. The culture of fear and complicity that had allowed Kevin and others like him to operate unchecked was about to face a reckoning. Angela Carter wasn't just here to investigate, she was here to clean house. And she wouldn't stop until the TSA was a place passengers could trust again. Angela Carter had faced challenges throughout her career, but as she walked briskly toward the airport's central operations hub, she knew this moment was different. She wasn't just dealing with a problematic officer or even a handful of complicit colleagues. The rot she had uncovered in the past few hours pointed to a much deeper systemic issue, one that threatened the integrity of the TSA at its core. Her discovery of Kevin Dunning's history and the layers of corruption surrounding him had ignited something within her. This wasn't just an investigation anymore, it was a battle to reclaim the very purpose of the agency she had sworn to lead. The operations hub was a large, sterile space, bustling with activity as staff monitored flights, coordinated security teams, and managed passenger flow. Angela's arrival sent an immediate ripple through the room. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and a palpable tension filled the air. She didn't need to announce herself. Her reputation and presence were enough to command attention. Angela scanned the room, her eyes locking onto a cluster of senior staff gathered near a bank of monitors. Among them was Supervisor Daniels, the man who had feebly tried to justify his inaction earlier. His attempt to downplay Kevin's behavior still lingered in her mind, a reminder of how deeply ingrained the culture of silence had become. "Supervisor Daniels," Angela called, her voice cutting through the murmur of activity like a blade. Daniels stiffened and turned toward her, his expression a mix of apprehension and forced composure. "Ma'am," he said, stepping forward, his tone carefully neutral. "Gather your senior staff," Angela ordered. "I want everyone in this room for a meeting immediately." Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, ma'am." He moved quickly to relay her instructions, his unease evident in the hurried way he spoke to his colleagues. Within minutes, the room was filled with TSA personnel, their faces a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and quiet dread. Angela waited until the last of them had gathered before stepping to the center of the room. Her posture was upright, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with anticipation. "What I'm about to say will not be easy to hear," Angela began, her voice steady and commanding. "But it needs to be said. This airport, this operation is failing. Not because of budget constraints, not because of passenger behavior, but because of us. Because of our failure to hold ourselves accountable. because of a culture that prioritizes convenience over integrity, that values silence over action. Her words landed like a thunderclap, the room so quiet that the hum of monitors and distant announcements from the terminal seemed deafening. Angela let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. This morning I witnessed an officer abuse his authority in a way that was not only unprofessional but dangerous. And as I began to investigate, it became clear that this behavior was not an isolated incident. Officer Kevin Dunnings is not the problem, he's a symptom. A symptom of a culture that tolerates misconduct, that looks the other way when rules are broken, that allows passengers to be mistreated and colleagues to be intimidated. She glanced around the room, her eyes meeting those of the staff one by one. Some looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Others straightened, their expressions hardening with a mixture of defiance and guilt. "I have read the reports," Angela continued, her voice rising slightly. "I have seen the complaints, and I know that too many of you have chosen to stay silent when you should have spoken up. Let me be clear. That ends today." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Angela pressed on, cutting through the noise. "From this moment forward, this airport will operate under a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct and corruption. Any officer found abusing their authority will face immediate disciplinary action. Any supervisor who fails to address such behavior will be held accountable. And any employee who participates in or covers up corruption will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The weight of her words seemed to settle over the room, pressing down on everyone present. But Angela wasn't finished. She reached into the folder she had been carrying and pulled out a stack of documents. "These," she said, holding them up, "are the complaints and incident reports involving Officer Dunnings. Some of you filed these complaints. Others ignored them. And some of you," her eyes narrowed, her tone sharp, actively worked to bury them. She dropped the stack onto the nearest desk with a resounding thud. "This is your legacy. A legacy of negligence and failure. But it doesn't have to stay that way. You have a choice right now, today, to be part of the solution, to rebuild trust with the passengers who rely on us, to restore integrity to this operation." Before anyone could respond, the door to the operations hub burst open, and two officers entered, their expressions grim. They approached Angela directly, one of them leaning in to whisper something in her ear. Angela's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened slightly. She nodded once, dismissing them with a brief thank you before turning back to the room. "It seems," she said, her voice quieter now but no less intense, "that this problem goes even deeper than I thought. I've just been informed that several pieces of confiscated property, high-value items have gone missing from evidence storage, items that Officer Dunnings was responsible for logging." A ripple of shock and unease spread through the crowd. Angela let the implications hang in the air before continuing. "This is no longer just a matter of misconduct. This is corruption, theft, and it will be investigated thoroughly. If any of you have information about these missing items, now is the time to come forward, because once this investigation begins, I promise you, the truth will come out, and anyone found complicit will face the consequences." The tension in the room was almost unbearable now, the weight of Angela's words pressing down like a storm about to break. She scanned the faces before her, searching for any sign of resistance or defiance. But for the first time, she saw something else, something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not the fear of getting caught, but the fear of having failed. The fear of having allowed things to go so far. Angela took a deep breath, softening her tone slightly. "I know this isn't easy. I know many of you joined this agency because you wanted to make a difference, because you believed in the mission of protecting our passengers and ensuring their safety. And I know that somewhere along the way, some of you lost sight of that. But it's not too late. We can fix this. We can rebuild. But it will take all of us, every single one of you, to make it happen. She stepped back, her gaze sweeping over the room one last time. You have a choice. Be part of the problem, or be part of the solution. But understand this, I will not allow this culture of negligence and corruption to continue. Not under my watch. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the staff to grapple with the weight of her words. Angela knew the road ahead would be difficult. The problems she had uncovered weren't going to be fixed overnight. But as she walked back toward her office, her resolve only deepened. This wasn't just about one airport or one officer. It was about the future of the TSA, and she was determined to fight for it, no matter the cost. Angela Carter sat at the head of the long conference table in the airport's main administrative office, the dim fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across the room. Spread before her were the damning pieces of evidence she had spent the past several hours gathering: Kevin Dunning's incident reports, passenger complaints, confiscation logs, and the informal notes from his colleagues that hinted at a web of misconduct far beyond what she had initially uncovered. The atmosphere in the room was electric with tension. Across the table sat Supervisor Daniels and two senior TSA officials from headquarters who had arrived after receiving Angela's urgent call. Their faces were grim, their postures stiff as Angela began to lay out her case. This isn't just about one officer, Angela began, her voice calm but edged with steel. This is about a system that has allowed misconduct and corruption to go unchecked. It's about a culture of silence and complicity that puts passengers and our reputation as an agency at risk. What I've uncovered here today is not only unacceptable, it's criminal. She paused, letting her words settle over the room. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between Angela and the pile of documents in front of her. The two senior officials exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Angela could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but it only fueled her resolve. This was her moment to take action, to make it clear that she wasn't just another bureaucrat content to let things slide. She was here to set a precedent. I have reviewed every complaint, every report, Angela continued, flipping through the stack of papers. Officer Dunnings has been accused of everything from excessive force to theft of confiscated items. And yet, time and again, these incidents were dismissed or addressed internally with no real accountability. Why is that, Supervisor Daniels? Daniels flinched at the direct question. His hands fidgeted on the table, his voice hesitant as he replied, we tried to handle these matters in-house. I thought it was better to keep things contained, to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Angela's eyes narrowed. Unnecessary attention? You thought it was better to protect the image of this airport than to protect the passengers and staff from an officer who clearly abused his power. Do you realize what you've done, Daniels? You've allowed a man like Kevin Dunnings to operate unchecked, to erode the trust that passengers place in us every single day. And now you're telling me it was to avoid unnecessary attention? Daniels stammered, his face pale. I didn't think it would escalate like this. It shouldn't have escalated at all, Angela snapped, her voice rising. If you had done your job, if you had acted the first time a complaint was filed, none of this would have happened. But you didn't. You failed. And because of that failure, we're now facing the fallout of years of negligence and corruption. One of the senior officials cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence that followed Angela's words. Commander Carter, he said, his tone carefully measured, you've clearly uncovered serious issues at this airport. But what do you propose we do about it? This isn't just about Officer Dunnings anymore. It's about the entire culture here. Angela straightened, her gaze unwavering. The first step is accountability. Officer Dunnings is already in custody and I've ordered a full audit of all confiscated items and incident reports from the past 5 years. Every officer involved in these irregularities will be investigated, and those found guilty will face disciplinary action, up to and including termination and criminal charges. The senior officials nodded, but Angela wasn't finished. But accountability isn't enough. We need systemic change. That means mandatory retraining for all TSA personnel at this airport, with a focus on ethics, professionalism, and de-escalation techniques. It means creating a clear and anonymous reporting system for staff and passengers to file complaints without fear of retaliation. And it means replacing supervisors like Daniel's people who have proven they can't be trusted to uphold our standards with leaders who can. Daniel's face turned crimson at her words, but he didn't dare respond. Angela's tone left no room for argument. She was in complete control of the room, and everyone knew it. As she outlined her plan, the door to the conference room opened, and a junior officer stepped inside, his expression tense. "Commander Carter," he said, his voice urgent. "There's been a development." Angela turned to him, her eyes sharp. "What is it?" "It's Dunnings," the officer said. During his initial questioning, he admitted to stealing confiscated items, but he also claimed he wasn't acting alone. He said there are others involved, higher-ups. The room seemed to freeze. Angela's heart rate quickened, but her expression remained calm. "Did he name anyone?" she asked, her voice steady. The officer hesitated before nodding. "Yes, ma'am," he named Supervisor Daniels. A collective gasp swept through the room. Daniels shot to his feet, his face a mask of outrage. "That's a lie," he exclaimed. "I had nothing to do with this." Angela raised a hand, silencing him. "Sit down, Daniels," she said coldly. "We'll determine the truth soon enough." Daniels hesitated, his indignation wavering under the force of her gaze, before slowly sinking back into his chair. Angela turned back to the junior officer. "Have him taken into custody for questioning," she ordered, "and have Dunning's statement verified. I want every name he's mentioned cross-checked against our records." "Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied, hurrying out of the room to carry out her orders. Angela turned back to the table, her expression unyielding. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, addressing the senior officials. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture of corruption that goes all the way to the top. And it ends here. Today." The senior officials exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them spoke. They knew Angela was right. The situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and there was no turning back now. Angela took a deep breath, her mind already racing with the next steps. She would root out every last thread of corruption at this airport, no matter how deep it went. She would rebuild the TSA's reputation, not just here but across the country, and she would make it clear to every officer, every supervisor, every passenger, that the days of silence and complicity were over. Because Angela Carter wasn't just here to enforce the rules, she was here to rewrite them, and she wouldn't stop until the TSA was a place of trust, integrity, and safety once more. The aftermath of Angela Carter's investigation sent shockwaves through the airport and beyond. The once quiet corridors of administration were now alive with the hum of activity as investigators combed through years of records, uncovering deeper layers of misconduct and corruption. Angela stood at the center of it all, her presence a steady force of order amidst the chaos. Supervisors were being questioned, officers reassigned, and passengers finally given the dignity of a smoother, more professional security process. Yet Angela knew this was only the beginning. Rooting out systemic corruption was like excising a tumor. It wasn't enough to remove the obvious, Every hidden fragment had to be found and dealt with before real healing could begin. By the time evening settled over the airport, Angela found herself back in the same conference room where hours earlier she had confronted Supervisor Daniels and the senior TSA officials. This time, however, she wasn't there to address misconduct. She had called a meeting with every TSA employee on duty that day. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the room was packed with a mix of apprehensive faces. Angela stood at the front, her posture commanding but not overbearing. She had spent hours piecing together everything that had unfolded, and now she was ready to deliver the message that would set the tone for the future of this airport, and perhaps the entire agency. "Thank you all for coming," Angela began, her voice carrying easily over the quiet murmur of the room. "I know it's been a difficult day. For some of you, perhaps the most difficult in your careers. But difficult days are often the ones that teach us the most. They're the days that define who we are, both as individuals and as an organization." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was heavy but attentive, every eye fixed on her. "I want to start by addressing what happened today," she continued. "What I witnessed this morning was unacceptable, but it wasn't surprising. The issues we've uncovered here aren't new. They didn't spring up overnight. They are the result of years, decades, even of complacency and neglect. And while that reality is painful, it's also an opportunity. Because now that we've exposed the problem, we can begin to fix it." Angela's gaze swept the room, her eyes meeting those of the officers, supervisors, and administrators seated before her. "But let me be clear," she said, her tone hardening slightly. "Fixing this isn't going to be easy. It's going to require every single one of you to take a hard look at yourselves, your colleagues, and the culture we've allowed to grow here. It's going to require courage to speak up when you see something wrong, courage to hold yourselves and each other accountable, and courage to change." She straightened, her voice steady as she continued. "Today, Officer Dunnings and Supervisor Daniels were taken into custody. The evidence against them is overwhelming, and I have no doubt they will face the consequences of their actions. But their removal isn't the end of this. It's the beginning. There will be audits, investigations, and retraining. There will be new protocols, new oversight, and new leadership. And there will be zero tolerance for anyone who undermines the integrity of this agency." The weight of her words seemed to press down on the room, but Angela didn't let the silence linger for too long. "I know some of you are afraid," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Afraid of change, afraid of what this means for your futures. That's natural. But I want you to know that this isn't just about punishment. It's about growth. It's about rebuilding trust not just with the passengers we serve, but with each other." She stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium. "And I want to be clear about one more thing," she said, her voice rising slightly. "If you're here today, it's because I believe you're capable of that growth. I believe you're capable of being part of the solution. I believe in you." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Angela's words settling over everyone present. Then, slowly, a hand went up near the back of the room. It was one of the younger officers, a woman who had been visibly shaken by the events of the day. Angela gestured for her to speak. "Commander Carter," the officer began, her voice tentative but growing stronger as she continued. I just want to say thank you. For not giving up on us. For giving us a chance to do better." Angela nodded, her expression softening into a rare smile. "That's all I ask," she said simply. "A chance to do better." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the tension giving way to something warmer, something hopeful. Angela could see it in their faces, the tentative spark of determination, the realization that change wasn't just possible but necessary. It was a small step, but it was a start. As the meeting concluded and the staff began to file out, Angela stayed behind, watching as they returned to their posts with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But Angela had no intention of backing down. She had taken this job knowing the challenges it entailed, and she had no illusions about how hard it would be to bring about real, lasting change. Later that evening, as Angela walked through the now quieter terminal, she noticed something that brought a sense of quiet satisfaction. The security checkpoint, which earlier had been a site of chaos and misconduct, was running smoothly. Officers were conducting their duties professionally, passengers were moving through efficiently, and the atmosphere was calm. It wasn't perfect, there were still issues to address, still work to be done, but it was progress. And progress, Angela knew, was the foundation of change. She stopped for a moment near the checkpoint, watching as a young officer helped an elderly passenger retrieve her belongings from the conveyor belt. The officer's kindness and patience were a stark contrast to the behavior she had witnessed earlier, and it reminded Angela why she had taken on this mission in the first place. To build an agency that people could trust, to create a culture of respect, professionalism, and accountability, to make a difference. As Angela turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from one of the senior officials who had been present earlier, commending her on her leadership and offering their full support for the reforms she had proposed. Angela read the message, a small smile playing on her lips. She had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time she felt optimistic about the path ahead. With a final glance at the checkpoint, Angela walked toward the exit, her stride purposeful and her resolve unshaken. The events of the day had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but they had also affirmed her belief in the importance of her work. She wasn't just cleaning up an airport, she was setting a standard, building a legacy, and proving that even in the face of systemic challenges, change was possible. And Angela Carter wasn't just leading that change, she was embodying it.